I was just coming up there and I had this feeling of deja vu. You know that feeling you get where you're somewhere and you think, I've been here before, and you don't know why or when or how, but it's just a feeling comes over you. And what really would have freaked me out if there was a flannel graph up there. Whatever happened to the flannel graph? It's all high tech now, isn't it? And as I do this, some of you might be getting a little deja vu too. Might be suffering deja vu. Suffering may be the key word, I don't know. Anyway. Got to have these days. You know the print's getting smaller? I thought these things were fixed. They're not. They just get smaller. My topic is restoring authentic worship. And that particular topic is a perfect lead-in to a question that's of current interest. And those of us who preach, of course, need to be attuned to what's going on in the brotherhood and in the world so that we're aware of what needs to be studied, what needs to be talked about and discussed and preached on. The fact that this topic is listed separate and apart from other topics illustrates the fact that worship is not all that we do. There is a separate entity called worship. When I was a boy growing up, we used the version of the Bible that St. Paul used. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 told us this: "Beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service." Now, I think we got what that was all about. I don't think we missed it years ago. But some later versions came along, and instead of having reasonable service, and you might have this if you check yours, it might have something like service of worship or words to that effect. The word is latrio. It comes from latris, which means a hired servant. And latris, it comes from latron, which means hire or pay. So the whole idea, the whole key to this word is the concept of service. Now, it's true, of course, that it can be applied to worship. We can correctly say we went to a worship service. But what, of course, it's produced, let me stick with that word, is a whole range of ideas now that everything we do is worship. And understand, there's translators, they're as subject to fads as everybody else. World is just overrun with fads all the time. And so this idea of everything we do is worship is becoming a bit of a fad. Well, our lifestyle is no more worshipping than we're physically laying ourselves on the altar. It's a metaphor, and we need to understand it as metaphor. And I think I know what brethren are trying to say when they say that all of our life is worship. They're trying to say a bit like what Daniel was telling us this morning. We're to be authentic. We're to be genuine in the whole life that we live. My call is, though, that we need to be more careful in our speech. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a little about this. The guy who wrote Animal Farm and what was the other one? 1984, George Orwell, he wrote about this too, about the way in which we become very slovenly in the use of our language. And both of them made this point, that when our thoughts become foolish and slovenly, then our language becomes the same. And I'm wondering how a whole generation of young people who are growing up now are going to deal with trying to understand the Bible when they come across the word wicked. When they say wicked, they mean it's good. And that's not what the Bible means when it says things are wicked. But Orwell and Lewis, they said that the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. You know, our forefathers in the church, they come up with various slogans for better or for worse. And one of the things that they said that would be good for us to focus upon is to call Bible things by Bible names and do Bible things in Bible ways. That's not bad for a slogan, as long as we understand it is just a slogan. And I think that was a wise way of looking at things. And I've been in the church a long time. And I do remember the old days, and we were more careful in the way in which we use language. We didn't go to church. No, we went to worship. And we were very careful when we filled out the forms that, well, it's all online these days. But when the census time was on, and they wanted to have a synopsis of how the country was divided up into various religious groups and so forth, and they would ask questions like, what denomination do you belong to, and so forth, then we would put down none. And we were careful about that, because that was indeed the truth. If you sat in Claude Gall's class in Holland Park back in 1971, when he taught the class on Revelation, if you said Revelations, he'd pull you up for that. Look at your Bible. It doesn't say Revelations, it says Revelation, singular. John had one revelation. When we came here, we didn't come to the church, we came to the church building. Because we were insistent on people understanding the church is not a building, the church is the people. So we would talk about going to the building, going to the church building. I don't know that we're that careful anymore. I think we're a little slipshod, perhaps. Well, how is this a problem with respect to our topic of worship? Well, for one thing, this is what I've noticed is happening in recent years, is that if everything we do is worship, some people are beginning to think, well, hey, why can't the women who do things outside of the services freely, why can't they do it inside the worship assemblies, as we call them? And so we have congregations now that are giving serious thought to, why can't we have women preachers? After all, women can become prime minister. They can become CEOs. And they can speak to their husbands at home and so forth. And it's all part of this problem. But on to the topic. Restoring authentic worship, I guess we could start by saying, is there a need? Is there really a need to restore authentic worship? I'd begin by asking you to just let your imagination run wild, or not run wild, but run to some of the worship services you've been in over the years, if you've got some sort of denominational background. But what we do see, there's a wide divergence of, call it, styles of worship in the denominational world, in Christendom, at least the visible aspects of it. We'll come back to the invisible aspects of worship later on. And you may have been to a charismatic church, you may have been to a Catholic church, or you may be like me, you, when you were a young person, went to a High Church of England church and so forth. And worship is completely different in all of those particular avenues. Is it all equally acceptable to God? There are many who would try and teach you that how you worship doesn't really amount to a hill of beans. Worship God how you feel. That's all that's important, as long as you worship God. And of course, in a pluralistic world, that's so appealing. But listen to John 4 and verse 33. In that verse there, John talks about true worshippers. True worshippers. Now that tells me if there are true worshippers, there are false worshippers. If there's true worship, there must be false worship as well. It's confirmed in Matthew 15 verse 9, and we were there before lunch, weren't we? Where he speaks about vain worship. In vain do they worship me, he says. So, we understand not all worship is acceptable with God. If you ever wondered why our Bible has got two parts to it, an Old Testament and a New Testament, and the Old Testament's a lot bigger than the New Testament, there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament. And it hasn't been preserved for no good reason. Romans 15 verse 4 says, all that stuff in the Old Testament, it says it's written for our learning. I'm sorry, folks. You just can't stick to the New Testament. God's preserved a lot of scripture for us in the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, likewise, talking about the Israelites and their journeying through the wilderness and the various things that happened to them and the various things that they did. Paul says that what happened back there is an example for us to learn from. So we need to take a heads up from ancient times. And the lesson is this: worship has always been a problem. There's never been a time when worship hasn't been a problem. We would be foolish to think that worship can't be a problem today. It started very early. Genesis chapter 4, first record of any sort of worship that we know of, and they got the very first problem. Cain's worship was rejected, Abel's worship was accepted. And you come through the Old Testament and there's a whole litany of things that you can learn from. Nadab and Abihu, they didn't honor God at all, didn't honor his choices, and they offered strange fire before the Lord. And they got burned to death for it. We come to Uzziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. He was the king. And he thought that brought him certain rights, and so he went into the temple to burn incense. And 80 courageous priests went in after him and said, out you get. You don't have a right to be in here. Go to Jeroboam in 1 Kings chapter 12 when the kingdom split. And he becomes head of the northern kingdom, but of course Jerusalem, which is the center of their religion, is in the southern kingdom. And so he doesn't want people running down to Jerusalem all the time. And so he sets up golden calves up there in Dan and in Bethel. And he says, don't need to go down to Jerusalem. We'll have our own worship. We'll have our own religion. And so he invented a new religion. It was modeled on the old religion. And you come through the Old Testament and you'll find more examples than that. And so, is there a need today to restore authentic worship? Well, we can answer that question simply by looking at what does the New Testament constitute as acceptable worship? One of the things that characterized worship in New Testament times was this thing that we call simplicity. Now, simplicity is not the same as being a simple Simon. Not at all. God has the ability to create things that are simple and yet so profound at the same time. Worship's like that. Listen to what Moshim's history has to say about early worship. He says, another circumstance that irritated the Romans against the Christians was the simplicity of their worship. which resembled in nothing the sacred rites of any other people. They had no sacrifices, temples, images, oracles, or sacerdotal orders. And this was sufficient to bring upon them the reproaches of an ignorant multitude who imagined that there could be no religion without these. Howise, in his church history, he goes a little further. He says, the simplicity of primitive worship, contrasted with the pomp of paganism, it was concluded by the heathen that they who had neither altar, victim, priest, or sacrifice must be atheists and without God in the world. Interesting, isn't it? That's how they considered Christians. They're about on a par with an atheist and obviously don't know God. So the worship of the early church was characterized by simplicity. And the worship in the early church, of course, was conducted according to the pattern that had been laid down by the apostles in that same era. And I think you're familiar with the things that are a part of New Testament worship. We find that prayer was a part of it. Preaching or teaching was a part of it. The Lord's Supper was a part of it. Giving was a part of it. And singing was a part of it. And, you know, I think we've got a fair handle on those things. I don't know how many congregations I've worshipped in my time in the church, but pretty much everywhere I go, I think we've all got a fair handle on what constitutes the simplicity of New Testament worship. But there are some worrying signs. And as I said, those who preach need to be aware of these things. 2 Kings chapter 16, starting there in verse 10. King Ahaz goes up to meet the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser. And he goes up to Damascus for this big powwow. And while he was up there in Damascus, he saw this exquisite-looking altar. And he looked at it and he said, I like that. I like that altar. I think I'll have one made just like it in Jerusalem. And he did. He did. He took down plans. And the plans were sent home. And he got his chief architect and chief builders and so forth. And they built this altar according to the one he saw in Damascus. Pagan altar. You know what they did? They took the altar that had been built when Solomon built the temple, the one that had been ordained by God, and they moved it out. And they moved this new butte altar in its place. Israel desperately wanted to be like her pagan neighbours. And we're no different. People are people. You know, get rid of the people out of the world will be all right. Be like being a school teacher, you didn't have kids there. People are people. And we want to be different like everybody else. Right? Yeah. A lot of young people are that way. And it's funny, you know, just when some denominational groups are getting rid of instrumental music, there are some in the church who desperately want to get it into the church. That went somewhere. There. Excuse me. There's no argument about singing. We sang just a little while ago. Nobody ever argues about whether we should sing or not. You know why? Because it's in the book. You can point to it. There it is. It says sing. But you see, what it doesn't say in the book is play. Big difference between singing and playing. But there's some in the church who want to play. They want to have a bit of that altar that they saw up there in Damascus. What's disturbing me is that more and more I'm hearing members of the church saying, you know, I'm comfortable with the instrument. I'm comfortable with the instrument. I've heard that more than once in recent times. And it's not because of study, I know that. It's not because they've looked in the book and got that. They've got it from somewhere else. Well, I've got news. And the headline is Psalm 19, verse 13. Keep me from presumptuous sin. Some versions probably have the word willful rather than presumptuous. We don't like big words today. And there is a lot of self-will in presumption. When Peter talks about a class of people in 2 Peter chapter 2, he talks about these people, and these are not nice epithets he's applying to them, but he says they're presumptuous. And the very next word he uses is self-willed. Those two are connected. They're very similar. If you look up the Greek word for that's translated as presumptuous in the old versions, it will list words like bold, or a darer, or audacious. Somebody who, pushes the limits. What's to go beyond what is authorized. So don't fall for the trap of thinking, well, I feel comfortable with the instrument, and think that because you feel comfortable with it, that God's comfortable with it. That's why we've got to get our head in the Old Testament and say, well, what are some practical lessons we can draw from all this? You know, when God ordains things, he doesn't ordain things and then sort of just cast around and sort of get some opinion. You all comfortable with that? No, God didn't do that, Look for chapter and verse for the things that you believe in and the things that you practice. You can get comfortable doing anything. Really. Mass murderers, they get comfortable killing people. If you were to find the young man, Saul of Tarsus, in his heyday as a young man, and you were to walk up to Saul and say, Saul, are you really comfortable with taking these people, men, women, and children, and then and having them put to death? You know what he would have said? Yeah, I'm quite comfortable with that. Quite comfortable. Throw that measuring stick away. Because when you do that, you're making yourself the measure, not God. There's a lot of ignorance in the church today because, and I'm sad to say this, but it's true. And I'm not exaggerating. But there are many young Christians today who have never heard a doctrinal lesson in their life as a Christian. Never heard them. Many of them are diabetic Christians because all they've ever had was sugar when they needed to have some porridge. Oh, they've been taught to be nice, and I've got nothing against that. And they've been taught to do nice things, and I got nothing against that either. But they've been taught don't ever be offensive. Many of them have never ever heard a lesson on the one church. Many of them have never heard a lesson on the sin of denominationalism. Many of them have never ever heard a lesson on marriage and divorce. Many of them have never ever heard a lesson on drinking booze or on gambling or on modesty or a whole range of other subjects that we might class as being doctrinal. Because you see, these things are considered to be confrontational and unchristian. There was a man one time, he got a job preaching in a congregation out in the country, and he got up there after a while and he preached a lesson against smoking. One of the members came up to him after the lesson and said, "Hey, you can't preach on that around here." He says, "Why not?" He says, "Well," he says, "half the farmers here, they grow tobacco to give to the tobacco companies to make cigarettes." Oh. So the next Sunday he got up and he preached against booze. And a bloke come up to him after that lesson, says, "You can't preach on that." And he says, "Why not?" He says, "Well, all the other farmers around here, they grow grain to sell to the whiskey company down the road." Oh. He says, "Well, what can I preach on?" He says, "I'll preach on one of them heathen witch doctors, and there's not one of them around here for 1,000 miles. That's the way some people do it. Some people take out a gun and they can't hit the side of a barn with it. Miss everything. And so he says, "You just preach on grace." Remember what the Jews said to Jesus. "We're not stoning you because of the good things you do. We're stoning you because of your doctrine, the things that you're saying." Many newer Christians, likewise, have never heard a lesson on the error of instrumental music in worship. They've never ever heard it. If they know anything at all, they know, well, it's our tradition. And they've probably had older members of the congregation saying, "Well, there's some old mossbacks in this church, you know, and they're pretty weak in the faith, and they've got some very tender consciences, and we don't want to upset them, so we sing without the instrument." Now, don't get me wrong. I appreciate the fact that they're looking at Romans 14 and they're considering the fact that we need to be aware of other people's consciences on various issues and so forth. But at the base of that argument, there lies a lie. And that's what our young people are growing up on. This tolerance, by the way, is the thing that's keeping some congregations together at the moment. That's the only thing that's keeping the congregations together, because as soon as the old mossbacks in the church die, you know what's going to happen. Yippee! Now we can be like Hillsong. And the world will come to our services. And congregations will split, as they did in times past. It's true, singing without instrumental music, that is a tradition. But when you do something twice, you've got a tradition. There are traditions and there are traditions. There are traditions of God, there are traditions of men. We're interested in those traditions which come from God. You know, there must have been a long, unbroken chain of weak brethren, starting from the apostles and going all the way through to the 7th century. Because you see, in that early church, in those first 600 years, church never used instrumental music. A lot of people don't know that. Even the present Pope, he accepts that. When it was tried to be introduced there, it created a huge furor and it was thrown out, but it sort of crept back in, and during the Dark Ages it became ensconced in the worship in Christendom. Do you know what a cappella means? I don't want to hear singing without an instrument. That's the way we use it. But the term a cappella singing It literally means of the chapel. The Latin expression, of the chapel. How did that ever get started? That's what it was. It was singing without instruments. What did they call it? A cappella, of the chapel singing. Because everybody knew in the church that's the way they sang. That's the way they sang. I know we've all grown up in an era where we think that organs, and now these days you can have a whole 20-piece band and so forth, that's sort of part of Christian worship. But there have been more centuries without instruments than with it. So how do you decide which is right? Is it the example of all those centuries without it, or all those centuries that have had it? Well, we've got to get back to the book. That's what you've got to do. God put music in Christian worship, but he told us what sort of music he wanted. Did he want mechanical music, or did he want vocal music? He said sing. That's vocal music. And don't come to me and try and tell me, oh, but, you know, an organ it's such an aid to singing. No, it's not. The organ or the drum or the guitar or whatever, it's not an aid to your singing, it's an aid to playing. That's what it's an aid to. The singing is authorized, the playing is not. There are things we can do to aid our singing, but we don't need to worry about trying to aid our playing, because the playing is not authorized in the first place. And if you think that instrumental music helps your singing, here's a little challenge I'm going to put to you. Go to a karaoke night. Go to a karaoke night and then get up there and sing with that musical instrument or band or whatever it is. And I'll tell you one thing, if you sing flat in the assembly, you're going to sing flat on that karaoke night too. It's not going to help your singing at all. Doesn't change your voice. What it does, of course, is drown out a lot of people who do sing flat. But that's all right. You can sing flat. If you sing flat in the assemblies, you will sing flat if you're singing with musical accompaniment. That's why not many people make a living out of singing. On a worldwide basis, it's very few people. It's very few people who dominate the popular charts and so forth. Some of you remember Dire Straits. They had a song out called Money for Nothing. Well, and people think, yeah, it's just as easy. Get a few mates together and we'll buy a couple of guitars and a drum set and maybe a little electronic organ, and we'll go out there. We'll get a few roadies and we'll go out there and hit the road and we'll get our money for nothing. Well, not that simple. Not that simple. Musical instruments will not disguise poor singing. But that's not a problem to us in the church. Because I want to get on to the real aspect of worship. And Daniel was talking about this earlier today. And that's to do with the heart. Most common word used in the New Testament for worship is proscrinio. It's an old Persian thing. That's its origins. And it literally means to kiss towards, to kiss towards. And it harkens back to early times when people would come before a king or a high dignitary, and they would get down on their knees and they would kiss their foot or maybe kiss the hem of their garment. It was the way of showing humility and homage and adoration and recognizing that this person that I'm bowing before is greater than I am. So over many years, this word, the physical act of proscrinio, was transferred to the mental act of worshiping. Worship is the idea of to kiss towards God. You see, unless there is an internal bowing down of the heart, there is no worship. No worship. We, and Daniel covered this morning, we can sing with the lips, but if the heart is not involved in that, then we've got vain worship. So this is the key element. To sing with the lips has the appearance of worship, but if the heart is not there, it's not worship. Some of you are familiar with those little Tibetan prayer cylinders. They're cylinders and there are prayers and so forth written on bits of paper and so forth in them, and they're set on spindles. Sometimes they're on the side of the road and other places, temples. And what you do is as you walk along, you see some of these, so as you go past, you give them a whirl. And they will start spinning. And that's your prayer. So by spinning those, the prayers that are actually on the bits of paper inside, that's supposed to be a proxy prayer for you, you see. You don't have to do any praying at all. You just spin the wheel. Sounds like a TV program, doesn't it? That's not worship. It's not good for us to speak about the 5 acts of worship. Rather, think of it this way. God has told us to approach him in a number of ways which he designed so that we could focus on what is appropriate in offering adoration to God. Now, it's true that we do certain actions in worship. For example, we use our hands and we use our mouth, our teeth and so forth, in the eating of the Lord's Supper. We use our lips, our tongue, our vocal cords in the singing of praise to God. And I know of some children who shall remain nameless, who on occasion have crept in to where the bread and the fruit of the vine had been set out in readiness for the worship service, and they had decided that they would avail themselves of what was being offered. Now, they went through the same actions as what the adults did during the worship service. Picked up some bread and ate it and drank some fruit of the vine. That's what kids do, I guess. But what was lacking was, of course, the internal aspect of that. And so what the kids did, that was not worship, although the action was the same. It's the internal aspect that makes worship. Worship, you could say, involves meditation. It involves getting the mind into gear and focusing upon God. You see, that's why deaf people can sing to God. And they do. That's why tone-deaf people can sing to God. And if you don't sing because you think, well, I'm not a good singer and I'm tone-deaf, or I sing flat, or I sing sharp, quit that. You can sing to God acceptably. And that's why instruments cannot praise God. When you hear statements like, and I hear this from time to time, people don't come to worship and they say, well, I don't get anything out of worship. Oh, I hate to hear that. Because the person who says something like that has no clue at all about worship, what worship's about. Worship is not what you get out. Worship is what you put in. Worship is not entertainment. I know you could get a wrong impression of that if you looked at some of the worship services that you see on YouTube and TV and so forth of various religious groups. It's high entertainment. It's a boogie-woogie full extravaganza. And people are all hyped up and so forth, but for the wrong reasons. Worship is not necessarily feeling good about yourself. Not at all. A man went down to pray one time at the temple and he beat his breast. He wasn't feeling good about himself at all. And he said, "Lord, be merciful to me. I'm a rotten sinner." And that was good worship. The Lord said it was. The Lord accepted that. At the time? All right. I'll just finish on this. I'm convinced that better attitudes in worship are helped by preparation. Giving must be pre-planned. I'm ashamed to say when I was a young fellow and the plate would be passed and so forth, I might find a few coins in my fob pocket or something and put it in. That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. We've got to give forethought to our giving. Get a reasonable night's rest on Saturday night. But Saturday night, that's the night for partying. Really? People drag themselves in Sunday morning and, oh boy, I didn't get to bed till 3 o'clock this morning. And they expect to be able to get the mind into gear to worship God. Oh, you're making it hard for yourself. And in the latter part of the 20th century, we got on another fad and we thought, oh, well, let's dumb down our dressing for worship. You know, when I was a young fellow, we grew up, we always put on good clothes to go to worship. Then we got into this fad that, it really doesn't matter what you wear. God looks upon the heart and all of that stuff, you know, and we thought that we'd figured on some new truth that all of those people for centuries hadn't seen. And we were guilty of this chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis called it. When we dress according to the occasion. That's the rule. When you go to various places, when you go to various occasions and so forth, the level of dress that you use is in accordance to what's going to be happening at this particular gathering. Some places you're not even allowed to sit there and chew gum. If a judge catches you chewing gum in the courthouse, he'll either throw you out or get you to throw the gum out. We afford all sorts of people and occasions respectful dress. My question for us to think about is, well, what about God? What about God? I'm not saying dressing is worship. It's not. Dressing is not worship. But I'm saying to you that I believe that in paying attention to how we present ourselves before the Lord and others, that helps us prepare our demeanor for worship. And it also helps our visitors to see, hey, these people take worship seriously. They've turned up here as if they're here to meet somebody important. They've turned up here as if this is some important occasion. They haven't come for a picnic or something like that. I'm shutting up.